Namaste. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today. We are gathered here for the fifth day of the International Deaf Week celebrations, a week dedicated to acknowledging the strength, resilience, and remarkable contributions of the deaf community around the world. Today's theme is diversity, which is both timely and deeply significant. It celebrates the richness within the deaf community and invites us all to reflect on how diverse perspectives. Sorry, extremely sorry, Suman sir, the voice still cracking. Sorry for the technical glitch. Invites us all to reflect on how diverse perspectives and lived experiences shape a more inclusive and understanding society. We are extremely fortunate today to have a distinguished speaker with us, Professor Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta. Professor Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta, who embodies the essence of diversity, both her research and her life's work. Professor Sangeeta is a highly respected professor who has held prestigious roles across multiple disciplines, including education, gender studies, rehabilitation, language sciences, and communication studies at renowned universities in Sweden, as well as in Italy, France, and India. Currently, she is a visiting professor at Maulana Azad National Urdu University in Hyderabad, India, and the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, in Paris, France. Her expansive academic journey has taken her to leading institutions across the globe, earning her recognition as a thought leader in communication, identity, culture, and learning. Excuse me, Suman sir, director sir, kindly mute. Sorry again. Okay. Professor Sangeeta ma'am holds a PhD in communication studies from Linköping University, Sweden, and completed her postdoctoral work in deaf studies at Gallaudet University, USA. Her research is grounded in ethnographic, socio-cultural, multi-scalar, and decolonial approaches, providing profound insights into the role of the deaf community in shaping communication and education practices. Her scholarly work is extensive, with contributions to over 10 international volumes, and continues to challenge the existing norms to foster inclusivity. Her latest edited volume, The Palgrave Handbook of Decolonizing the Educational and Language Sciences, peddles which comprises 37 chapters, was submitted for publication earlier this month. This monumental work speaks to her ongoing dedication to inclusive education and decolonial thought. In addition to her academic achievements, Professor Sangeeta ma'am is multilingual, fluent in spoken, written, and sign languages, emphasizing her belief in the power and beauty of communication in all its forms. It is truly an honor to have her with us today. Now I request our director, sir, Dr. Suman Kumar, sir, to say a few words.
Thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation to be with us today as a part of International Week of the Deaf People 2024 celebration. As our colleague, head of the department, Dr. Gayatri Madam, has already shared with you the events which we have undertaken in last 5 days to commemorate this International Week of the Deaf. Uh, on behalf of Ali Awajan National Institute of Speech and Hearing Disabilities, I formally welcome you, Sangeeta Madam. I know you have been very kind to us since uh, many years. I request your kindness and cooperation in near future also in terms of academic and research advancement. I won't take much time because much has already been talked about you, and we have already shared about what we have been doing it to promote the sign language, the diversity, the achievements which the person with disability or person with deafness has achieved in our country and across the globe. So, with your vast knowledge in the discipline, I think we would be enriching our knowledge after listening to your lecture. Over to you, madam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome Professor Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta ma'am as she shares her valuable insights on today's theme, diversity. Over to you, Sangeeta ma'am.
Thank you for these kind words, Gayatri and Director Kumar, and for welcoming me to this week of your celebrations where you celebrate diversity in all its forms. I was asked to talk about diversity in deaf communities, and I have tweaked that title, and I have a three-layered title talking about what diversity is and can be, and how we need to diversify our understandings of diversity. So I will be trying to talk about diversity in any community, and then particularly about our need to go beyond the very dichotomized way of understanding deafness and what is a deaf community. So diversity more in terms of deaf hearing communities. We are hearing people, some of us who are members of signing communities. Some hearing people are not members of signing communities, but maybe working with deaf children and adults. So there is that variation in hearing communities, hearing people who are working with signing communities. But within the deaf community, there is no pure deaf group. Deaf parents with only deaf children who never meet any hearing people. So for some time, I have been pushing for recognizing deaf hearing communities or deaf hearing worlds as the de facto state of how we live our lives. So I'm going to be going through the dichotomies that exist in terms of position 1 and position 2, and then draw our attention to going beyond this and trying to understand the richness of the human condition. Okay. So what I plan to do is to introduce some thoughts from the scholarship, from my own research and the research of my students and colleagues in an introduction, and draw attention to why we have organized deaf education, for instance, or support for deaf people in terms of sameness and difference. So these fundamental ideas are very rarely discussed in our area of scholarship, that is deaf studies. So I'm going to draw our attention to sameness and difference, to then go into a discussion of how can we transcend this, how can we go beyond this. And finally, a large part of what I will share with you is trying to push for the everydayness, who we are, ourselves, our own positionalities, and then go beyond this mainstream or this very dominant way in how we think about deaf studies, this area, and how this can be approached to change our thinking, but also change the lives of people who we are committed to. So this is who I am. I work in Jönköping University. That green arrow shows you where that is located. And this is a map of the southern half of Sweden. I live in a tiny village of less than 2,000 people between the capital of Sweden, Stockholm, and Oslo, which is the capital of Norway. So if we look at this huge subcontinent called India, we wouldn't even, this country called Sweden would not even be a black dot in the rural part of India. So it's a very, very small country where I live. And these are the areas of scholarship that I contribute to fundamentally, and I am working across time in these identity areas. And so these are my areas of engagement. And what I am doing now is to try and tell you who I am, so my own positionality. And as Gayatri pointed out, I did my PhD in the area of communication studies at a very unique doctoral institution at Linköping in Sweden. And then I went on to do my postdoc. So my doctoral work was not on deaf studies, it was on gender and ethnicity studies. I went on to doing my postdoc at Gallaudet University. And then I worked as a senior lecturer and an associate professor and professor at Örebro University. And since 2017, I work at Jönköping University. So that is a glimpse of who I am. But who am I to come and talk to you about the complexities of the area of deaf studies? As Gayatri pointed out, I am multilingual in spoken, written, and signed languages. So I could be giving this lecture in Swedish Sign Language, but then I would miss most of the audience in the Indian subcontinent. So I am grateful to Atya for collaborating and offering what I have to say to signers, hearing and deaf, who engage with Indian Sign Language. So in this introduction, I want to draw our attention to some specific ideas within communication studies that we miss in deaf studies. So I'm going to illustrate these ideas through pictures, through words, and through videos. So here is a script. You recognize it. You probably don't know what this is. Kvinna. This stands for another word that you probably recognize, woman. And if I wrote aurat, I would lose a number of people who can't read the Devanagari script. But if I transliterate that into Latin, you would be able to read that. These are signages. These are words. This is another way to depict these words. And if we had time, you could then look at this picture and then see either an old woman's face or a young woman's face, or both at the same time. If I asked you who this is, you would probably say it is a woman, even though we can't see. Could be a man who has a dupatta on their face. This is another depiction. This is an exhibit at a museum many years ago, and we would say this is a woman. Okay, so similarly, in Swedish Sign Language, STS, this is the word for woman. In American Sign Language, those of you who know American Sign Language, this is the word for woman. In British Sign Language, so in America and Britain, we speak English, different Englishes, but there is a completely different sign for the same word. And actually, you would find different signs in England for woman. In Indian Sign Language, and I'm looking at Atya now, I think this is woman. So there is no one-to-one correspondence between kvinna, woman, aurat, these pictures, or these different signs on the hand. These are all different terms. So language has a representational and constitutive function. This would not be a good sign for woman if I was in India, because showing a body part of a woman is not seen as respectful. But that is a sign that is used here in Sweden, from where I am talking to you. This would not be understandable here in Sweden, but it probably draws upon a particular jewelry that women wear. Not all Indian women wear that. So again, my point is that we need to understand the representational function of words that then become meaning-making tools. And there is no one-to-one correspondence, either when you are speaking or writing or signing. Okay, so that was one point that we need to remind ourselves. Another point is, and here is a word that Sweden has contributed to English historically, and that is the word ombudsman. So we have an institution for justice We have an equality ombudsman in Sweden, and that is for gender equality. And then we have an ombudsman institution for discrimination on various grounds. We have a children's ombudsman, we have a disability ombudsman, we have an ombudsman against discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. And these have come up across 100 years or so. So there is an emphasis on equity, on inclusivity. But what would happen to a person who is blind, who is confined to a wheelchair, 16-year-old girl who migrated to Sweden a couple of years ago from South Africa and who lives in the city where I work? Where would this human being turn to if they felt discriminated against? Would they go to the Children's Ombudsman, to the Disability Ombudsman, to the Equality Ombudsman? And this is how we can draw our attention from the rules and regulations that society has to the everydayness and the complexities of human living and lives. Okay? So for instance, India has a law that allows for deaf people and people with various disabilities to get an employment in different sectors, in the government sector and in the private sector, in the corporate sector. We don't have that law in Sweden. So when I look at this law in India, I feel that we need that kind of a law in Sweden. How would that law support this 16-year-old person living in Sweden who feels discriminated for various reasons? Because we don't have this law of employability for everyone, for the diversity of people who live in Sweden. In research over 60 years ago, researchers created this concept to draw our attention to the complexity of everyday life, intersectionality. And intersectionality came into gender studies because women scholars of color, so a scholar like me, if I lived at that time, felt that the equality work that white women in the US were doing was not supporting their lives. They needed to see race and gender work. And to this, I want to add disability, I want to add class, I want to add age. So intersectionality is the mundaneness of each one of our lives. So that is a second point with language and identity. A third point that I want to draw attention to is the fact that seeing something is not neutral. And I'm going to share with you a short video to show you, to allow you to experience what is happening when we see something, when we look outside our window or when we read something. This is not neutral. We always come from a particular position.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Okay, so I've shared with you 3 illustrations to try and draw our attention to the need for understanding the complexity of our lives, of how we ourselves as human beings understand, for instance, diversity. So let me kind of bring these together. We have assumptions about knowledge, we have assumptions about language, about things that we learn, what learning is. The Swedish terms in learning, learning inside, utlärning, teaching, is often understood in terms of things, stuff. Mathematics, music, culture, identity gets conceptualized as something that we have, that we own, that can be transferred, that is stored somewhere, either in our heads or in schools or in books. It is an individual capacity. And that is why in schools and at universities, we test children and adults individually, because we consider knowledge to be something that exists within us. And we create boundaries. We understand language A as not being language B. So Swedish is not English, and what is English is not Indian Sign Language, and what is Indian Sign Language is not Swedish Sign Language. So this is how we understand. These are assumptions that we have. But there is a major shift taking place in the theories that are related to language, to identity, to learning, in terms of the plurality of knowledge. So there isn't a knowledge, there are many different knowledges. So we see terms like languaging, mathematizing, learning as meaning making, musicking. So there is an emphasis on the doing, on what people actually do. So then identity becomes identity positionings. And this needs to be understood in terms of people's everyday lives. So what do people do in the mundaneness of their lives? This is understood in terms of how we can reformulate people's experiences. That is what learning is. So it is interaction with others and with tools. So languages are chained. There is no code switching between Swedish and English, or between Hindi and English. These are chained in people's everyday practices. So these assumptions need to be recognized as we understand the diversities within and between different communities. So there is this major shift taking place, and I am going to now talk about what consequence this has for research. For those of us and those of you who are engaged in research, we need to see that it is not inheriting a worldview, but it is challenging a worldview that we do through the word research. So it is not a reproduction, it is a research. It is challenging what we have understood. And I'm going to try and challenge our understandings within deaf studies. So it is rethinking. So it is not people, but it is people in interaction with one another and with tools. And language is also a tool. My mobile phone is a tool. My pen is a tool. So how we interact with one another is the fundamental point of departure, not a person, not the body of a person. So it is not talking just what people say, either through their hands or through their mouths or through their writings. It is the understanding that communities are always imagined. So when we say there is a Swedish community, it is imagined. When we say that there is a deaf community in Sweden, it is an imagined community, because we are then missing out on the variation, the complexity, the heterogeneity of that community. So if we shift our gaze and look at what people do, their performance, not in a theater sense, but in the theoretical sense of the mundaneness of everyday life, their doings, then we try and identify patterns. So it is these micro level life happenings that then become the interesting issue. So if you're interested in these kind of ideas, there is a lot of literature out there. Here are two of my own contributions. These are old books. They came out in 2019, I think, or 2017. Identity Revisited and Reimagined. And some of my own colleagues and my own students have made some very rich contributions from deaf studies in the book in red. And here is this double special issue that I edited, and I will share a couple of references later on. In Deafness and Education International, where this kind of understanding of identity positionings is present. So what I have said so far is that participation and inclusion needs to be understood, not in terms of that you take a person and put that person into a group, but in terms of everyday actions, of what happens to people in different settings like schools or workplaces or universities or in the marketplace, or when a family is sitting and eating dinner, who is communicating with whom, in which modality. When we then focus on everyday actions, we become aware of the importance of understanding power relationships, focusing on the alternative knowledge sources, not just my way of understanding communication when I am studying a family sitting and eating lunch, but understanding the power relationships there. So what alternative knowledge sources can allow me to enrich in my understanding of that? This is very rarely done in research, and that is why the term empirical ghetto, the poverty of the kind of data that we engage with, is captured in this concept. Okay, now what does all this have to do with deaf studies? I'm going to present now two very prominent, dominant positions that I think most of us who are listening, seeing my presentation will recognize. Position one is the oral, medicinal, psychological position where the method or the model of oral ideology, the oral ideology, is very dominant. This dominated in the 1980s after the very well-known Milan conference, where oralism was supported, and then it saw major support again in the 1950s and 60s. And this is across the world because we saw outer ear hearing aids being developed. And then from the turn of this century, when cochlear implants became available more and more, we saw another major thrust for oralism. So technology has played a very important part in position one. This position one builds on sameness. So we think that creating inclusion should build on the idea that all human beings are the same. So deaf and hearing people are the same. So we must bring this person who is not able to hear through this approach that has a very strong medicinal, technological approach. We need to bring them into the sameness of being human, and that we must do through hearing technologies. I will share with you a short clip from data from one of my older projects, where I worked together with Ingela Holmström, one of my former PhD students. Ingela is an associate professor at Stockholm University today. Ingela is deaf. I am hearing, but we both speak Swedish Sign Language. In this particular project, we were shadowing children who had received cochlear implants and who were in mainstream hearing classrooms. And what you will now see is the training this hearing child is getting for Swedish. So whilst everyone else in the classroom is studying Swedish texts, this child has been pulled out into a small space, and we call this child Ella. That is not her real name. And then there is a resource person who is sitting with Ella on a sofa, and they are training the hearing of the child. So Swedish gets reduced to, the language Swedish gets reduced to how much the child can hear.
Programmet. Ja, bra. Emily känner sig onyttig.
Emily känner sig onyttig.
Där hon går omkring. Där hon går omkring.
Där hon går omkring.
Med armen i mittellan.
Med armen i mittellan.
Hon sover dåligt om nätterna.
Hon sover dåligt om nätterna.
När hon vänder sig om.
När hon vänder sig om.
Kommer armen i kläm.
Kommer att.
Armen i kläm.
Kommer armen i kläm.
Okay, so what the adult was doing was removing a very important resource that I use. I'm a hearing person. I look at people, particularly on Fridays when I'm tired here. I look at the person's lips to try and decipher what is being said. So communication is much richer than just hearing something. Communication is embodied. We use our arms, we hearing people. When we are just speaking with other hearing people, we turn our gaze, we turn our bodies, we look at one another's eyes. That is part of communication. So if you are talking with someone and that person's gaze turns away, as a hearing person, you know that that person does not want to talk to you. So we are doing all this. This is the complexity of the mundane, the social practices. What this adult is doing is that the adult is taking a book to cover this. So the focus on the Swedish becomes hearing. So this is learning by hearing, which was Ingela Holmström's PhD thesis title. That is available in English, and you can download it. If someone is interested, I can send the link to you. So this is an example of the first position, what happens through oralism. Language gets reduced to oral language. There exists a bounded language that is the correct modality. And that is what happens, what we do when we speak. We hearing people speak from our mouths. It belongs to, is owned by hearing people. It is their first language. It exists in a place, in the head. It exists in a school, which is a mainstream school for hearing people. What I want to draw attention to is that it is norm steered. These are norms that we have created that we believe to be the truth. I will take you to, from the principle of sameness to the principle of difference, and use this to show you that white and colored people were at one point of time in our history seen as being different. So when support was given, it was given to colored people to come into the norm of the mainstream. I don't expect you to read this, but these are, I've done a number of analyses of how we have looked at language in the Swedish national curricula since the 1960s onwards. And we've just got new curricula that have just come up in this year. So the salient point is that from the 60s to the 80s, there was no discussion about different languages. In the 80s, we saw the emergence of something we call home language. So there is something in the home that is the child's language. In the 1990s, that became mother tongue. And pupil categories started emerging, which is coming to how we then differentiate between the normal diversity of human populations. We started in the 1990s also seek vocabularies in the curricula in terms of first, second languages and categories of students. So immigrants started studying something in the 1990s that was called Swedish as a second language. Deaf children started studying something that was called Swedish as a second language for the deaf. So these categories of pupils emerged only in the 1990s. They did not exist from the 1960s onwards. Remember, Sweden is a very small country. We are only about 10.5 million people. So it is easy to do a case study. It would be very difficult to do this in the landscape of India. Okay. This illustrates position 2, that we differentiate, the principle of difference. We human beings are different, so we need to give different support for different groups. This brings us to how within deaf studies, we have something called the manual method, signing, sign linguistics, visual, cultural. Deaf people have their own culture. Again, coming back to my earlier point, there are no communities where deaf people live completely isolated from hearing people. You have deaf parents who have deaf children. You have deaf parents. Most of them have hearing children. You have hearing parents who have deaf children. Most deaf children have hearing parents who have never met signing. So this kind of heterogeneity needs to be recognized, but position 2 doesn't do that. You have sign language ideologies, you have bilingual ideologies. These emerge, as we all know, in the US in the 1970s. In Sweden, it comes up in the 1980s and 1990s. So we segregate. In Sweden, something very special, which has not been there in any other part of the world, is that we have two things. One is, well, one school for all ideology exists in the Nordic countries. So you have Denmark, Sweden, Norway, the Nordic, the Scandinavian countries with Finland. We have this ideology of one school for everyone. But what is special in Sweden is that we have always had a segregated school for the deaf within this ideology. So it is the principle of difference that allows deaf children in Sweden to be in an isolated school where earlier on it was oralism, then it became signing, and then different things happened. Okay, so language is seen as sign language. Again, the belief that there is a bounded language that is a correct modality, which is signing on the hands. It belongs to and is owned by the deaf. And here we start seeing, if we are interested in social practices, then we start saying, how can a deaf child who is growing up in a hearing family where parents don't know signing, how can this be their first language? So we start seeing the problems with our own vocabularies. It cannot be a first language. It can be a primary language. It can be the most easily accessible language, but it is not a first language. We have a belief that it must be safeguarded, for instance, in a school for the deaf. This is also norm-steered, is my argument. So positions 1 and 2 both focus on the needs of the deaf child, if we are now interested only in the deaf. Language is seen either as oral or sign, and this hinges upon giving deaf children literacy. This has been recognized in the literature in terms of a great divide, because proponents of these two positions very rarely meet. they live their own parallel lives. So we have teaching methods, the oral method, the sign method, the Rochester method, but the bilingual method. We have school models that are segregated, that are integrated. In Norway, we have both of them. In Sweden, as I said, it is a very segregated system. And this model has dominated, but one model has always dominated in Sweden. But CI, cochlear implants, has changed this landscape. So norm steering needs to be understood in terms of a fundamental bias that is incorrect. It builds on monolingualism. It gives the richness of deaf children in a place like, in a country like India, it makes them monolingual. Your first language is Indian Sign Language. It is seen as being monocultural. We have this idea of homogeneity, which is incorrect, which does not exist anywhere. And this builds on the misconception of that one country or one state in India should have one language. This emerges in Europe a long time ago, but this is very strong. This belief is very strong. It is an ideology. And that is what gives the idea of a community of practice, that language, there is one language and there is a community of practice. The richness of human communication goes beyond this one language, one human body, one country. So while we have this idea of one school for all in a place like Sweden, and one culture for all in a place like Sweden, the misconceptions around these concepts can only be busted if we go beyond these ideologies. So focusing on policies needs to be transcended, because a focus on policies can only be norm steered. Okay, so where are we going now? What does this mean for the area of deaf studies? A position 3 then would recognize that we all participants in a community, all members of a community participate in languaging. They do language. Language is not something that we have in our heads. In Indian spaces are speaking if you are in a space like Mumbai, you are speaking in Mumbaiya Hindi and in Marathi and in Gujarati and in English. No one even thinks about it. Everyone is just languaging. Things like that happen in Sweden, but we don't recognize it. And then, so who is this person? Who is this so-called multilingual person? Is the person becoming Maharashtrian just because they're speaking Marathi, or becoming Indian when they're North Indian if they're speaking Hindi? And what happens to them when they speak in English? The position of that person remains the same. So what is positioning then? So this needs to be based on empirical research of what people do across time and spaces in their everyday lives, as I have been trying to push for. Human beings are a languaging, culturing creature. We are not just one thing. So in this sense, deaf hearing worlds need to be recognized. So in your setting, I am unable to use Swedish Sign Language, but I am still part of the deaf hearing world of your community, at least for this hour. So again, coming back to signs are semiotic resources, and they include body language. So it is very important for us to see what and how we see one another, how we label people and how we label communities. And that is why my lecture today is, as the first slide showed you, it is diversity in deaf hearing communities. There is no deaf community. There is no hearing community. I become a hearing person when I meet a deaf person. Otherwise, I am a human being. Okay, so this kind of thinking has gone on in a number of research projects And I'm just listing them to show you that this is not something that is just a philosophical point of departure. In these projects, and some of them have had a bearing in Indian spaces, GTGS was Gender Talk, Gender Spaces research project that took place in Mumbai and in rural parts of Rajasthan. But gender, ethnicity, ability, age, and other identity positionalities have been part of these different projects. My most recent project was called Paul, Participation for All, ? And it was looking at two very different groups from an anthropological point of departure, people who are deaf and people who have neuropsychiatric labels like ADHD and DAM, autism, and other labels. So we were looking at different groups and we were following them in their everyday lives, and we learned a lot. Developmental projects where this kind of thinking comes in have also been engaged with, and I would want to point to a think tank that is ongoing. It is called the Participation and Inclusion Think Tank. The Do It is an acronym that comes from the Swedish Delaktighet och inkluderingstankesmedja. So what does this mean? This is a non-ideological perspective. It is position 3 is non-normative. So we don't come into as researcher or as people interested in developing schools, spaces for deaf people in terms of that oralism is correct or signing is correct. There is no such point of departure. Point of departure can be in an old book that came out that was called Many Ways to be Deaf, International Variation in Deaf Communities. This is more than 20 years ago that this book came out. And my first doctoral student and I published a chapter in this where we looked at the case of Sweden and he finished his PhD in 2000. So it is 24 years ago. And he retired. He was much older to me. What this means is that instead of having segregated schools or integrated, so-called integrated mainstream schools for deaf children, we should have a profile school with Swedish Sign Language and Swedish for all. This would be independent of the hearing levels of teachers, support personnel, and pupils. So anyone could participate, could be a member of this school, and then the teaching would take place in Swedish Sign Language, STS, and Swedish. This is similar to what we have in Sweden, for instance, the international English schools or the Swedish-Finnish schools. Anyone can become a pupil in an international English school where the teaching is done in Swedish and in English, or in the Swedish-Finnish school where the teaching is done in Swedish and in Finnish. You don't have to have some kind of blood from parents who are pure Finns to be a member of that school. My point is that you don't need to be deaf or need to be hearing. Swedish Sign Language is a language, just like English or like Finnish. So we need to, a third position allows us to imagine this. This is the meaning of culture for all. So it is not the visuality, it is the visual orientation that is the important thing. If we then have a bilingual school where Swedish Sign Language and Swedish, or in your setting, if it could be, I don't know whether Indian Sign Language is something that exists everywhere in the huge subcontinent, or whether there are variations of that in Maharashtra, in the urban setting of Mumbai. So then it would be, let's say, Mumbaiya, Indian Sign Language, and Marathi, or Hindi, or English, or whatever. So it would be the normalcy of multilingualism that would come. And then anyone should be able to study in such a setting. So again, the emphasis on deaf hearing words. I want to end by reading something from a book that came out in 2019. And this book, Maimugni Nagomane, there you see it in front of you on this slide, is called Everyday Ubuntu, Living Better Together, the African Way. And I am reading from Archbishop Desmond Tutu's foreword. The author of this book is Desmond Tutu's granddaughter. And this is what Desmond Tutu says. The lesson of Ubuntu is best described in a proverb that is found in almost every African language, whose translation is, a person is a person through other persons. The fundamental meaning of the proverb is that everything we learn and experience in the world is through our relationships with other people. We are therefore called to examine our actions and thoughts, not just for what they will achieve for us, but for how they impact on others with whom we are in contact. So Ubuntu is a person through other persons. I share with you on this slide a couple of research papers, book chapters, and articles, all of which are open access. One of them I have written on my own. The others I have written with colleagues and former students of mine, who I work intensively even today, Petra Wäckström, Julia Messina Dahlberg, and Lars Almén. And I will be very happy to share these with you. You can click them and read more about the third position. And in these different articles, they focus on different groups, but a large focus is on deaf and hearing collaborations. Thank you. Gayatri, should I stop sharing?
Yes, Sandra. Yeah, it is always a valuable learning experience when Professor Sangeeta ma'am is present. Her insights bring a fresh perspective to understand diversity. So here's the first question on my WhatsApp ma'am from one of my own students. How can education systems be adapted to better reflect the diversity within the deaf community, ensuring that all learners feel represented and included?
So this is very easy. I mean, this is what the third position could help us imagine. So if we buy into my argument that there is no pure deaf community out there, that we are members of it. So on the screen right now, we are we are 3 women, all hearing. One of them is an Indian Sign Language interpreter. How can we say that she is only hearing? Athia is a member of the deaf hearing, Indian deaf hearing community. Similarly, I know, Gayatri, that you are a fluent user of Indian Sign Language. So how can we say that you are not a member of the Indian deaf hearing community? I don't know Indian Sign Language, so I'm definitely a hearing person who is not a member. But I am a member of the global deaf hearing community. So if we buy into this very important argument, then our schools should represent this richness. The problem that I know that exists is that hearing people tend to take up the oral languaging stance, marginalizing deaf participants. So this is a problem of how teaching, how the leadership of such a school could be, needs to work on. But this is not a problem of the position, the assumptions within that position, position 3. So the third position would push us to first recognize this, to recognize that there is a need to have girls and boys from different sectors of society. So that could be either class-based or it could be based on different other labels that we use in Indian settings, to bring all of them into this. So why should hearing siblings of deaf children not be part of that environment? So that would be my push for a third position, thinking to build up such a school.
Okay. We have one more question. What role do you think deaf role models and leaders play in promoting the diversity of experiences within the community? And how can we ensure that they come from a wide range of backgrounds?
A very good and a very important question. I will go back over 2 decades ago. I was invited to a school in a village outside Milan in Italy. And I was invited to give a keynote at a very big conference that was near Milano. And then I was allowed to be an observer in this school. The reason this school, and it was this school and the researchers who had been working in this village school who had organized that conference and where I was invited to. The reason I asked for being part of that school in 2003 was to understand the ethos. So the school was a regular hearing school, and many years prior to that, it was their 10th anniversary, so you can count, must have been in 1993, that the mayor of that little village had 3 deaf children who would have been sent to Milano to a deaf school. And he thought that why should these children be taken away from their families? So he approached the school principal and said, can't we have a school for these children here? And can't they be members of this school? And they said, and the deaf community over there said, the deaf people, no, the children should not be here. They should be sent to the segregated school where they will get signing and support. The priest said, no, we should keep the family together and we should encourage everyone to learn a little bit of signing. The deaf adults were not pleased with that at that point. And I have met these deaf adults. They work in that school and they work in the primary levels. They work in as the teachers in the, what do you call it, kindergarten and the nursery levels, where deaf and hearing children are there, and deaf teachers teach everyone all the subjects. So my week over there convinced me fundamentally how wrong we are in not creating this kind of school. In this school, I still remember there were 160 pupils. Only 40 of them were deaf. The rest were all hearing. They were studying the syllabus in Italian Sign Language and Italian. And in one particular class, they had a mathematics test. The teacher was the only one who did not know Italian Sign Language, and the children were openly cheating, and the teacher couldn't do anything about it. My point is to show you that, of course, if I was deaf, I would also feel that hearing people would take over. But these deaf role models who were against this changed, and they made sure that it was everyone learned Italian Sign Language. I have seen such schools in other parts of the world. I know that they exist in many parts of the world. We all know that we have communities where deaf and hearing people, where deafness was not something abnormal. because everyone spoke American Sign Language. So this is possible. Great question.
Last question. What do you see as the biggest challenge in embracing and promoting diversity within the deaf community, and how can these be overcome?
I think it is the fact that we are not willing to, all of us, we are not willing to move. We are either in position one, so we believe that oralism is the only thing that can help. So we have this principle of sameness, or we are entrenched in position two, so we believe that it is only signing that can save. So I think each one of us needs to move if we are to achieve a third position. Without that, that is our own ideologies and our own inability to understand that whatever I have as a researcher published previously can be wrong, or my own ideology needs to shift. And that is the power of a third position.
True. Wow. No more questions. Let me see if it comes in YouTube. So I'll post those questions later on to you. So now, on behalf of AYJNISST Mumbai, I would like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to Professor Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta ma'am for accepting our invitation and sharing her insights on the theme diversity within the deaf community. Position 1, position 2, position 3. I always say this whenever you have a session with Professor Sangeeta ma'am, you always learn new terms, new concepts, and a new perspective. Thank you, ma'am. Your expertise and perspective have added immense value to today's session, and we are truly grateful for your time and dedication. I would also like to express my sincere thanks to Atya Haji, our sign language interpreter, for making this session accessible and inclusive for all. Your work has played a crucial role in ensuring that this discussion is open to everyone. Lastly, a big thank you all of you who are being part of this event. Let's continue to stay connected and work together to promote diversity and inclusivity within our communities. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.